So, our youth group, Horizons Youth Group, middle school and high school, we've been working our way through the book of Daniel, which has been super awesome. And at this point, we've passed the halfway mark of Daniel, and so we're in a lot of Daniel's visions and prophetic dreams, and they're crazy. If you've read Daniel and you read some of them, you're like, what on earth am I reading? And so we've been getting into that, which has been actually really fun. And it's cool how when you study it out, you find that there's so much more like that can be learned. You know, like I read a lot of those prophecies and I'm like, well, we'll find out one day what that meant. But there's actually a lot that we can know now when you really study some of the historical context, some of the, do your research. And so that's been cool. But anyway, that's not the point. For today's purposes, we're actually going to be in the first half of Daniel and sticking mostly within the first 4 chapters. And we'll jump around a little bit, so I'm not in any one specific passage. One of the main characters we see in the book of Daniel is the great King Nebuchadnezzar, and that's who we're going to look at today. So this will be a bit of a character study, I guess you could call it, and just looking at his life, who he is, how God interacted with him throughout his life, at least as much as we see in the Bible. So to understand who King Nebuchadnezzar is, we're going to cover several short stories that happened in his life, and I'm going to try to keep the stories condensed enough that we stick to our main points, because I could do a sermon on each of the individual stories. But we're going to keep them condensed, but hopefully not lose the heart of the individual stories as we use them to paint a picture of kind of what the lifelong themes that were happening in his life. So when you study King Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, you inevitably learn about Daniel, the author of this book. You also learn about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, otherwise known as Rakshak and Benny, for those who know. So as we study King Nebuchadnezzar, we will inevitably be looking at them a little bit as well through some of these stories. Even though they aren't the main character for today's purposes, we're considering King Nebuchadnezzar our main character, but we can still learn a lot from them and how they interacted with Nebuchadnezzar. So in my last kind of preface or warning for you guys is that I'm probably going to call him King Neb a lot because it's so much easier. And I got in the habit in youth group, and when I was typing my notes, it's like every time I had to type Nebuchadnezzar, I was like, this is such a grind. So I just shortened it to Neb. So my notes say Neb, and if I'm reading my notes, I'm gonna say Neb. Sorry. I do have a buddy who calls him Chad, because right in the middle of Nebuchadnezzar is Chad, and I'm not kidding. I told him this week, I was like, yeah, I think I'm gonna teach on, I'm going to teach on King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, oh, I love Chad. Man, that's going to be great. I was like, Chad, what are you talking about? And it took me a second. It was like knee-jerk reaction. He heard Nebuchadnezzar. He's like, Chad, yes. Anyway, so that's an option for you guys. I'm not going to do that this morning, but you just tuck that away. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's pray as we dive in. So, Lord, thank you again for this morning. Thank you for your goodness and just singing these songs of worship to you. And your love and mercy is just evident throughout all of time, all of creation, and in our personal lives we see it evidenced as well. And it's amazing, Lord, as we look at Nebuchadnezzar, that your heart was for King Nebuchadnezzar as well, and just as it is for us. And you make no distinction between the rich and poor, the lofty or lowly, but you love us all on an equal playing field, and you sent Jesus to die for all of us equally, and it's an amazing truth that we get to walk in, Lord. And so we're so thankful, and as we study your word and study this man's life, I pray that you would just guide the time, help me communicate clearly, and teach us by your Holy Spirit that you do a work in our lives as we continue to grow in our faith and our understanding of you. So we just commit this to you, Jesus, in your name. Amen. So King Nebuchadnezzar, who was he? We keep calling him king. I keep calling him king, and that's because he was the king of the Babylonian Empire that we see in the Bible. Historically, this is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire because it was the second empire that came out of Babylon over millennia. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he was their greatest king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He reigned for 43 years, and his reign kind of marks what the golden age of that empire would have been. So quick Bible history review for us to understand where this is at in scriptural context, Israel's history. So we're backing up a bit. So Moses led the Exodus out of Egypt. They entered the promised land, which would become Israel. And then the Israelites were ruled by judges for a while, which is what we're studying in the book of Judges. After they got tired of the judges, they got kings and became a monarchy. It didn't go well for them because they kept rebelling against God. And so their nation got split into two different kingdoms, a northern and southern kingdom. They kept forsaking God, so it didn't go well for them. And eventually the northern kingdom got absolutely wiped out by the Assyrian Empire. And a few centuries later, the Assyrian Empire and the southern kingdom got absolutely wiped out by the Babylonians. So the Babylonians, for our context, is the new big empire. They were able to help defeat the Assyrian Empire. They completely, over time, leveled Jerusalem, and Israel had been wicked and forsaking God. They'd been turning to idols, and the Lord had been super patient with them, and yet they would not turn back to him. And so eventually, as he had promised, they were destroyed and taken captive and spread across the world. So the Babylonians, for Israelites, for Israel's sake, was a great enemy and a very opposing force for them as they experienced it. And so like I said, over the course of time, Babylon would level Jerusalem just to the ground. Their walls were torn down. Solomon's beautiful temple that had been built and it had been standing for centuries, absolutely destroyed. I think the prophecies say not one stone on another, just painting that picture of it was gone. It's not like, oh, well, at least the foundation is here to build back up. It was just gone. So when Babylon would conquer a nation, they would often deport the inhabitants from their homeland and scatter them out throughout the Babylonian Empire. So they did this to Judah, the southern kingdom. They came in and they took everyone away from Jerusalem, and they only left the poorest of the poor there to take care of the fields. And by leaving the poorest people there, they were pretty securing the fact that there would not be any revolting in that nation after the army left, because it was just poor, weak people left. Everyone else they got and took and scattered throughout the nation, and they would have to just accept their new fates as Babylonians. They got relocated in a new place, new culture, miles and miles from home, no way to get back, not really anything to go back to, even if they tried to, because it had been laid to waste. And by doing that, it actually strengthened the Babylonian Empire because it integrated other nations into their nation rather than just trying to contain them where they were at around the world. In addition, they would take the best of these exiles and actually recruit them for the king's service. And so Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, they end up being some of these nobility and royal descendants from Israel's kingdom that get recruited directly to serve in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. And because they had noble blood in them, they were well educated, they were handsome, strong, smart, all that. Nebuchadnezzar could recruit them to work for him, and then that strengthened his empire because he had better people working for him. And again, the result was that Babylon's conquest was really complete. When they conquered a nation, that nation was not expected to return. It was done. It was a done deal. The people were scattered. The nation, the culture, completely removed. So, as far as world powers go, Babylon was no joke. And I'm going to read a prophecy in Habakkuk about Babylon. If you want to turn there, you can. Habakkuk 1, 6 through 11. And just listen to this description of the Babylonians, also called the Chaldeans. The Lord says, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that grim and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to take possession of dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrifying and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are faster than leopards, quicker than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen charge along. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. They gather captives like sand. They make fun of kings, and they laugh at fortresses." The description goes on of this people that's just absolutely ruthless and terrifying and unstoppable. And that's how the world perceived Babylon. And Babylon lived up to that. They conquered distant lands. They expanded their territory. And any nations that they didn't conquer, they either subdued them or allied with them, like some of the distant kingdoms. So despite its greatness, or maybe because of its greatness, I don't know, Babylon was a completely pagan nation. And idol worship drove their culture just as much as it drove the cultures of the nations around them. They had a national god named Marduk, also called Bel. But they would have believed in many gods, and they would have had no problem believing in the God of Israel. But they probably had this mindset that their God was the superior God because the Israelites got destroyed. So obviously their God wasn't strong enough to save them, and our God is superior because we're conquering the whole world and because he's got our back. So that's probably what their mindset would have been. And so along with their idol worship, they would have practiced astrology, fortune-telling, sorcery, other detestable practices that the Lord abhors. And so this nation was not just, neutral, secular. It was a wicked nation, actively doing things that were detestable to the Lord. And it's worth noting that in Revelation, in some of the Revelation prophecies about the powerful world power that will be on the scene in the end times, that nation is referred to as Babylon. And so it's not literally Babylon, but Babylon is the name given to it to identify it and give us a picture of its character. And it's a nation described as being just super wealthy and powerful, but just completely wicked and completely depraved. And so it's worth noting that the name Babylon gets used for in that context. That gives us a picture of what it was like historically. And that it really was an awful nation as far as their morality went. Despite being a great nation politically, their culture, their people were wicked. So that's Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar was their king, and he was their government structure was a monarchy. So he was absolute king, absolute authority. He didn't have to worry about checks and balances. Anything King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do, he did. And because of that, in a lot of ways, King Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian Empire, in a sense. Anything that happened in the empire was an extension of his will, his commands, his actions, his leadership. So everything you could see of the Babylonian Empire, you could point all the way back to King Nebuchadnezzar because he had absolute control. And so let me find what I'm missing here. I'm missing something. 1 second. All right, there it is. So Nebuchadnezzar, he was considered great himself because of this position that he had been put in. And there's a couple of passages in Daniel that give us a picture of his greatness. And so since we're already in Daniel, you can flip there and read in Daniel chapter 2, verse 37 and 38. I'm pulling these verses out of context for the sake of what they tell us about King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 2, 37 through 38, this description we get. "You, O king," talking about Nebuchadnezzar, "are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. That's a pretty powerful description. That's a lot of authority. This prophecy thing that the Lord is saying through Daniel to the king is that he's been given authority over everything, even the wild animals and the birds. And now you can turn to Daniel 5, 18 and 19. So that one was spoken directly to Nebuchadnezzar. And then in Daniel 5:18, this is spoken about him after he had died. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. So at just a word, King Nebuchadnezzar could do anything he wanted with anyone's life. He wanted to raise someone to greatness, the word was said, it was done. He wanted them put to death, he said the word, it was done. And we're going to see that is how he functioned. And so everyone feared him. So this is the I guess caliber that Nebuchadnezzar was already in the world power kingdom, and then he is the sole leader of it. This is a big personality in a big context, but again, completely pagan. So for most people, Babylon would have been considered the most powerful force on earth, but in reality, we know that God was and is completely in control. Babylon's rise to power and its destruction were both prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, one guy who lived almost 100 years before Babylon was even on the scene. Isaiah prophesied their rise and downfall. And other prophets also prophesied along those things about the rise and fall. So God clearly had a plan. He knew what was going to happen. Though Babylon thought they were great, the Lord was in control. And ancient kings typically had this idea that they were superior beings, even to the point of being worshipped like a god. And King Nebuchadnezzar seemed to fall into this realm. He had a puffed up sense of self. He was arrogant in light of all that he had accomplished. But we're going to find that God wanted to show Nebuchadnezzar that he was not the one who was great. It was the Most High God that was great. It was not Nebuchadnezzar who had made Babylon the great nation it was. It was the God of Israel who had lifted Babylon up for his purposes. The one true God, not any of these other false gods. So that's Babylon. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Now let's look at some of these stories that we get in Daniel. And you can go back to Daniel chapter 1. Again, because I'm going to cover these stories with kind of a overarching view, we're not going to get all the details, but these are fun stories to read. If in your personal time reading the Word, I completely recommend just going through these stories. They read easily, they're fun, there's a lot of cool things to learn through the details of these stories. But first, in these first 3 chapters, Daniel 1, 2, and 3, each chapter has a story. It's like condensed, a story per chapter for the first 6 chapters, really. But I realized that in each of these first 3 chapters, there's kind of this progression where God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar in steps that kind of goes out and in and gets a little more tangible and personal each time. So you'll see what I mean as we go through it. So in chapter 1, we see that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they're pulled into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar, while he's still prince, not king quite yet, he conquers Jerusalem or does the first attack on Jerusalem, pulls these guys into captivity. Again, like we said, these guys, they were of royal descent or noble blood. They were smart, handsome. They were qualified to serve in the king's palaces. So they got placed in this academy that was basically like a re-education or indoctrination academy. It's like Babylon University to teach them the Babylonian ways and culture and literature and basically qualify them so that when they graduated with their degree, they could get their first job right there in the king's court, basically. So these guys, despite their circumstances, they decided that they were committed to obeying the Lord, even though the temple was destroyed. I guess it wasn't destroyed yet, but even after it was, even when the temple was destroyed, they were ripped from their homeland, their nation was conquered. They knew that God was in control, and unlike a lot of their brothers and sisters, they decided, we're going to stick with God. We're going to obey his commands. So when they got offered the food of the Babylonians, these people in this academy were given the food from the king's table, which would probably be pretty good food. And they were offered it, and they refused it because it wasn't clean for the Jews. It wasn't kosher. It was probably sacrificed to idols, and so they refused it. And it would have tasted great, but they were more committed to the Lord than to their stomachs. Some of us needed to hear that today. And the alternative for them was vegetables and water. Oh. And I gotta bite my tongue, my child. I cannot let him know that I hate vegetables. Anyways, so they go to the alternative. Vegetables and water is all that these guys are eating, and despite their vegetarian diet, God blessed them and physically strengthened them. And then at the end of their 3-year academy, they were evaluated by the king, and we can read in verses 18 through 20 what this assessment was. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. That's quite the report. The Lord blessed them for their obedience in a unique way. You know, he doesn't promise that type of blessing for everyone, but in this instance, he was using them to make an impact in the culture they were in. So it might seem small, but the first thing that King Neb saw of the Lord was that God's people were different. He saw these Jewish kids were something else. They were on a totally different level than their peers, even though they're just eating vegetables. Is crazy. And, you know, for us, we're called to be the light of the world, and we know that, but it's a good reminder that oftentimes the first glimpse that someone else ever gets of God is when they see a true Christian. And they recognize that, whoa, there's something different about that guy. Like, I know he's a Christian. Like, maybe that has something to do with the way he is. But, you know, and there's just that kind of in the back of their mind of like, okay, like, I might not disagree with everything about that person, but there is something different. And Nebuchadnezzar could see in these young boys from Judah that there was something different. And he didn't necessarily know what it was yet, but their reputation honored the Lord in that once he did know who the Lord was, it was even more support for it. So I hope that we are living in such a way where even if people disagree with our beliefs, they can't deny that there is something different about us, our behavior, the joy we have, the love we have, etc. So that's the first little story. King Nebuchadnezzar just gets this glimpse. So now looking at the second story, it gets a little more personal for him. So the second story happens probably pretty soon after Daniel and the boys got recruited to the king's service. Probably pretty soon after that, this story happens. King Nebuchadnezzar, he has a dream or a nightmare that wakes him up in the middle of the night, and he's troubled by it, and he can't get back to sleep. And he's stressed about it, so he summons his magicians, his enchanters, his sorcerers, and his astrologers, and he summons them, and he tells them, "Tell me what my dream was." And that's not the request they were expecting. They were expecting, and they tell him, they're like, "Well, tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means." And he says, "No, tell me what my dream was first, and then explain it." And he's serious. He's dead serious. In chapter 2, verse 5 and 6, we see how serious he is. He replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your house turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." These poor magicians and enchanters, astrologers are at their wits' end. Like, that's not possible. No one could tell you the dream that you had. They make a comment about only the gods would know, but the gods don't live among men. And they'll be surprised to find out what happens. So, because no one could tell him what he had dreamed, he knew it. He knew what he had dreamed, but he wanted to make sure that no one was going to deceive him with a fake explanation. That was why King Nebuchadnezzar was set on this. He didn't want his astrologers making up some reason just to keep themselves off the chopping block. He wanted to know that the interpretation he got of the dream was true. And so he went to these extreme measures. And yes, they were extreme, but the Lord was in it. So unfortunately, because no one could interpret it, every wise man and enchanter and astrologer and so forth in Babylon was sentenced to death. Every single one. Not just the ones in that room. Every single one. Which meant that Daniel and his friends got sentenced to death. And they found out about it after the fact. And so once they find out, they get together, they pray and seek the Lord because they don't want to die. And that night, God reveals the dream and the interpretation to Daniel. So Daniel comes in and he saves the day. He comes to Neb and tells him both the dream and its meaning. And if we look in verse 46, despite Nebuchadnezzar's apparent hard-headedness and stubbornness, he genuinely recognizes that this is an amazing miracle. So again, in verse 46, we see his response. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. So this response is really remarkable from the king. And he says that God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, the revealer of mysteries. And at face value, if I was just reading this out of context, I'd think, wow, King Nebuchadnezzar gets it. But we got to remember that this was a culture that believed in many gods. For King Nebuchadnezzar to acknowledge this, we find out, it didn't really mark any change of heart for him. He just realized, whoa, there's a really powerful God here that I better show honor and respect to. But he continues to worship his own gods. It doesn't change his life in any sort of way, as far as besides a little bit of intellectual understanding about this God of Israel. So again, first, Nebuchadnezzar sees the difference in the people around him, and then he gets a personal understanding of God's sovereign knowledge, at least in the spiritual realm. And then the third story we get in chapter 3 is the popular story of the fiery furnace. We're not given a timeline here, but I'm sure some time has passed. And in short, in this story, King Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant golden statue and tells everyone who works in the government to bow down to it and worship it. Of course, idolatry was strictly forbidden and for Jewish people. That's like the first 2 of the 10 Commandments. And so Rakshak and Benny, they do not bow down to this idol. They are government officials. They get summoned to this celebration, and they don't do it because it's against their law, and they know that there's only one true God. They will not bow down to any idols. Predictably, this gets them into trouble because the king had told them to do something, and they didn't do it. They got ratted out, and King Nebuchadnezzar is completely furious with these 3 guys because they disobeyed him. And if you look in verse 15 of chapter 3, he's really angry, but he actually gives them a second chance. But he makes sure that they know the consequences if they don't. In verse 15, he says, to them. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Wow, that's a statement that's pretty interesting. That, of course we expect him to have this anger at being blatantly disobeyed, but then that statement, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" First, we see that in Nebuchadnezzar's previous statement about God to Daniel, you'd think he'd have more respect for the God of Judah, because they're saying that we won't bow. They tell him, "We won't bow to any God except, our God." And he has no respect for it. He's like, "Yeah, whatever." And then we also see that he has a view of his own power being greater than that of any divine power. He communicates very clearly that he doesn't think that there's any divine power that could stop him from burning these guys alive. And based on his reputation and who he was, that could, if it could be true of anyone, it would be true of King Nebuchadnezzar. But of course, that's not true of anyone. These three guys, they declare their faith in God, that God might save us. But if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down. And King Nebuchadnezzar gets so angry that his face contorts, and he commands the furnace to be heated up 7 times its normal amount. And he throws them into the fire as soon as he can. But God rescues these three. Many of us, if not most of us or all of us, know this story. They're able to walk around freely in the furnace. They weren't even, they were bound up. Their bindings got burnt off, but then they didn't get burnt at all. They didn't even overheat. I don't even think they sweated. And they got out, and it says they didn't even smell like smoke, even though they were walking around coals and fire. So King Nebuchadnezzar and all his officials are watching. They're just totally dumbfounded. They're completely amazed. And if you look in verse 28, the king makes this statement. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way." So he acknowledges God again, just like he did before, but now he even makes a public declaration about it. He declares to the entire world, if anyone says anything bad about the God of Israel, we're going to cut you into pieces and tear down your house. So like I said before, we see this interesting progression as the Lord reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar. First, he sees the evidence of God working in other people's lives, and then he sees it at a spiritual, intellectual mind level. But then here he sees, whoa, this is the God who has power over physical matter and authority over these things. And despite these amazing statements he's made about God, King Nebuchadnezzar still hasn't addressed any of the personal implications about these events. He saw God's miracles as an external thing, but he never stopped to ask, well, what does this mean for me personally? And this is something I think we see surprisingly often when someone sees and recognizes what God has done, and they can look at the Christians in their life and say, wow, like there is something different about so-and-so. But then they never take a hold of it themselves. And I was remembering that I've heard Ronnie share this from the pulpit of, an old friend or family member saying something like, wow, Ronnie, like you really have changed. I'm glad you found something that works for you. It's like, this isn't just something for me. This is for you too. This is for the whole world. And for some reason, humanity has this tendency to put up this wall, this disconnect. And honestly, sometimes Christians do it too. Though we may be saved, we see the Lord working, and he wants to do more in our lives, and we see what could be possible, and we just decide that that's awesome that that's happening for everyone else. That's awesome that they finally found peace that surpasses understanding. and whatever it is. And so maybe that's someone here today where you've seen that God is real. You can't deny it. You've seen how he's working, but you haven't accepted it as applying to your own life. Belief in God is good, but it can't save us. We have to put our faith in God. And Nebuchadnezzar clearly believed in God, but it had no value for him without faith. One of my favorite analogies or illustrations is like if I'm jumping out of an airplane and I believe that the parachute sitting next to me could save me. It's like, wow, yeah, that parachute, I know exactly how it's built and packed. I know that if I jump out of here with that on my back, it has the power to save me. But then if I jump out without the parachute, it's not going to save me. Because even though I believed in its ability to save me, I didn't take a hold of it. I didn't put it on. I didn't apply its purpose to my life. And faith is this active thing that needs to be responded to. Our belief in God needs to have a follow-up of action showing that, yes, I do believe this. And I'm actually staking my reality based on it. I'm going to put this on my back because I know I do believe that it will save me when I fall. So I just wanted to mention that challenge for us. If there is anyone here who you see God working, but you're just keeping it at arm's distance, it's probably because to accept it in your own life means that you're going to have to change something. And we don't like doing that. We hate changing things that, even when it's bad, even when it's like anger or bitterness or something like that, where it's like, oh, like I don't want to have to work to change that. That's going to be more difficult. It's going to be humbling. It's going to be embarrassing. Whatever it is. But God has so much more for us if we would put our faith in him. And even for Christians, believers here today, if the Lord's calling you to something more, I encourage you, put your faith in him and pull back your arms to keep it at arm's length and embrace what the Lord has, even if it is less comfortable than just the alternative. So this was Nebuchadnezzar's situation. He had God at arm's length, even though he'd seen it, but that wasn't enough for God. So that leads us to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is kind of the climax of Nebuchadnezzar's stories with God. And this whole chapter is actually written by King Neb himself. And it's a crazy thought that this intense king of this super pagan nation penned a whole chapter of the Bible. Like, it's not about King Nebuchadnezzar. It is about him, but it's by him. It's a public decree. If you look in the first 4 verses, we'll just read the first 4 verses. The first 3 verses. It's addressed from King Nebuchadnezzar to the people, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world. May you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. So this chapter is King Nebuchadnezzar making a decree, a declaration to the entire world about what God has done for him. And then he continues to tell the story of what God has done for him. So, again, I'll have to summarize this story a bit, but the point of the story is that Neb has another crazy dream. The dream is about a great tree getting cut down, and once again, only Daniel is able to interpret it. We can actually read more of this in verse 24 through 27. Daniel gives the interpretation to the king. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree. The Most High has issued, this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. Basically, This dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has is prophesying that though he is powerful and great, he's going to go insane. He's going to fall and go clinically insane until he acknowledges that the Most High God is the one who's sovereign over the kingdoms of men. So Daniel's advice to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, repent, practice righteousness, show mercy to the oppressed, renounce your wickedness, Daniel says to him. And we'll find that it does not seem like Nebuchadnezzar heeded Daniel's advice. If he did, it was temporary. It's possible that Nebuchadnezzar reacted temporarily to the news he got. Maybe he was like, "Oh, that's bad. I don't want that to happen to me." So he changed a couple things in his government and kind of bandaged up a few things. But then over time, he got lax and just reverted back to where he'd been. If he tried to make any changes, that's all it was temporary. It's possible that he just disregarded it entirely. His view of the Lord was such that it seems possible. Regardless, time revealed the status of his heart. And as we read in verses 28 through 30, it says that all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" This guy says some crazy things. He's walking at 12 months, a year prior, he'd received this prophecy about how he was going to get torn down. And a year later, he's walking around and he's like, I have done this. This is what I've done. This is my majesty, my glory, that I have accomplished these things. And while he was still speaking, the judgment happens. A voice comes from heaven, declares the judgment. Nebuchadnezzar goes insane. And the description of how he loses his mind is that he basically thinks that he's a cow or an ox. He's on his hands and knees eating grass. His nails grow out, his hair grows out and is unkempt. Sleeping outside so that the dew every morning was on his back, like an animal. And just to kind of try to paint this picture, I want us to imagine if there was a real life person who lived like this around our lake. Doesn't that start to feel a little weird? Yeah, that's what I thought too. It would make us feel so uncomfortable. We would feel so much pity, and it would be embarrassing because it's completely unnatural. All the moms in the church would be like, keep your kids away from that animal, man. And all the guys would be like, stay away from my family. And even if he was docile, it would just make us so uncomfortable. It's a very weird picture. It's a very humbling picture. And this is even more dramatic because of who the man was. This wasn't just some lowlife who finally got to the end of his wits. This was the great King Nebuchadnezzar, who the nations feared, out there in a field eating grass with long hair and long fingernails and dew on his back. It's a crazy picture. And the time period that's described is 7 times, which the common understanding is that each time was a full year. So basically everyone believes that he was insane like this for 7 years. That's a long time. Think of what you were doing 7 years ago. Imagine being an ox for that long. It's crazy. But just like God declared, Nebuchadnezzar regained his senses at the end of that period. And so now we'll read verse 34 through the end of the chapter to see how this turns out. So at the end, Nebuchadnezzar is still speaking. He says, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. That's a powerful turnaround. And every sentence there has a bit where it's like, whoa, I see the change. I see the change. And, he had talked kind of like this before. So when it comes down to it, we don't know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know if it was a true faith that lasted or if it was still an external humbling. But personally, I can't help it. I just got to believe that we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven one day. I'm not going to die on that hill because I can't prove it. But man, I see this turnaround, and that it feels real. It feels genuine. And that description of those who walk in pride, he's able to humble. For the most prideful man on planet Earth to look to God and say, okay, I'm nothing compared to you, God, is such a stark contrast to his previous statements of what God can save you from my hand, that he had said before. Regardless of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar after this moment, regardless of that, I think that God's heart in this is the most amazing part. Because if there's ever a camel pulled through the eye of a needle, it was Nebuchadnezzar in this moment, being humbled to finally acknowledging God. A true miracle, not just on the physical realm, but the spiritual realm of his change of heart. And it's a reminder for me that God's heart is for every man and woman on earth, no matter who they are. If there's ever a candidate to just skip straight to God's wrath and judgment and discipline, seems like Nebuchadnezzar would be the type of candidate you'd put up there of like, oh, he destroyed God's nation and was pagan and wicked. Like, if there's anyone who just deserves judgment and we know the outcome, like, it's got to be Nebuchadnezzar. But that wasn't God's perspective. He reveals himself to King Nebuchadnezzar multiple times over the course of years, patiently bringing him to this place of humility before God. It wasn't just a one-time, like, all right, Neb, this is your only shot. It was long-suffering and patient, and God's hand of love is extended to all of us in the same way. His heart is that we would come to know him, not reject him, and he's willing to wait out the long term to see that change. Ronnie said it before, how awesome would it be if any of our nation's leaders came forward today declaring the name of Jesus and what he's done in their lives, and that they were committed, they've been saved by Jesus Christ. That would be amazing. I mean, and that's like a smaller scale of what we see Nebuchadnezzar doing here. But what would our response be? Do we share God's heart in that? Would we be excited at the possibility that a politician is now saved? Or would we be critical because of what they've said and done in the past? And, there's room for skepticism. We want to know that it's legitimate. But I pray that we would continue to grow in God's heart of love for every individual, where we want to see, we want to believe that, oh, I think the Lord changed them, because that's what the Lord wants to see. And as we love the way that he loved, I think that should be how our hearts conform and mold into. So for Nebuchadnezzar himself, the big lesson in all of this was that God was the one in control, not Nebuchadnezzar. As much as mankind likes to think that we've accomplished anything, we're reminded in this book that only God is in control. And yes, we might work hard for some things, but it's still God who allows those efforts to find success. And so all of us, regardless of what we've done or haven't done, can look to the Lord and say, all right, Lord, every good and perfect thing is from you, and I can trust you with the outcome. Nations and peoples, they rise and fall, just as Nebuchadnezzar himself declared in verse 37, that everything God does is right and his ways are just, and all of the wickedness in the world, it will be punished. All the righteous will soon receive their reward in heaven, and we can trust God that he is in control, that he is sovereign, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing for us. And as we start to wrap up, I want to point out the role that Daniel and his friends had in Nebuchadnezzar's life. They were employed by a nation that destroyed their homeland And it's remarkable that they were even willing to serve at such a high level. They were working for the enemy. Their lives had been ruined because of this nation that they were now being an asset to and helping promote the welfare of. And I think it shows a humble acknowledgement that they realized that God had put them there, so they were going to honor God and do their best with wherever he put them. And, imagine if they decided to do a half-hearted job. If it would have reflected poorly on them. It would have reflected poorly on their country and on God. And they definitely wouldn't have gotten these opportunities that they ended up getting to minister to Nebuchadnezzar, because they would have probably got demoted instead of promoted. But because of the positions they held, the Lord was able to use them to minister to even the most powerful man on earth. I've seen it in my life where I had at least one coworker that I can actually remember who is an outspoken Christian. This is years ago. She's an outspoken Christian, but she was kind of immature and complained a lot, and not everyone got along with her. And I could tell that people just didn't really respect her faith, even if they liked her as a person. She wasn't a bad person or anything, but even if they liked her as a person, there was nothing appealing about the faith that she had because of her character. How she carried herself in the workplace didn't honor God. It actually made, for some people who are already maybe bitter towards God, it would have, if anything, reinforced their presuppositions about him. And we don't want to do that. We want to honor the Lord the way that Daniel and his friends did, where even in the worst circumstances, they said, all right, we're committed to God. We're not going to compromise anything, but we're going to live for him and do our best here, because this is where God's put us. And this is the light that we get to be to the world around us. And through their obedience, not only did they minister to King Nebuchadnezzar, but then Nebuchadnezzar put out these decrees to the entire world. And so because they were faithful, it set off this chain reaction that ministered to the entire world that the Most High God is God and is all-powerful. Yeah, it's amazing how the Lord used them because they were faithful where they were at. And so that final reminder for us as we look at them is to just consider, where's the Lord put me today, and where's my heart? And if my boss is a Nebuchadnezzar type figure, am I ready to love him and minister to him, knowing that God's heart is for him? Or am I stuck doing a half-hearted job because I don't really care about what happens to this company or this, I don't know, insert whatever your scenario is. I pray that our hearts would continue to conform more like that of the Lord's for the world, because that's how God has loved us first, and we should be carrying it forward. So that's King Nebuchadnezzar. So worship team, you can come on up.